The highway was silent, except for the echo of fading tires. Max, a brown dog with a scar across his muzzle, lay bruised and trembling after being thrown from a moving car. His ribs pressed through his thin coat, and his golden eyes filled with pain. In the distance, the red taillights of the sedan vanished, carrying with them the cruel laughter of his former owner. Max whimpered, torn between chasing the car and collapsing into darkness. The narrator said, "Here begins Max's story, not in comfort, but in cruelty, where survival must be chosen." Slowly, Max staggered to his feet, each step heavy yet stubborn with will. Max limped along the gravel shoulder, paws torn and bleeding from hidden stones. Each breath came in ragged bursts as hunger gnawed deep inside him. The narrator said, "He does not walk with direction, only with refusal to surrender." Coyotes howled in the distance, sharpening his fear. His head jerked at every sound, body coiled to flee. Yet ahead, a faint street lamp glowed like a fragile promise. Max's heart whispered, "Not yet. I will not fall." Max closed his eyes, and a memory flickered. Once in sunlight, he had bounded across green grass, a boy's laughter ringing behind him. Ethan, a blond child, had thrown a stick, and Max had chased with joy. The narrator said, "But memories turn cruel when reality is nothing but hunger and cold." His paw struck a sharp stone, tearing him back into the night. The warmth of the past dissolved, replaced with betrayal that cut deeper than pain. Max's nose twitched as hunger drove him into weeds by the road. He ripped into a discarded bag, finding scraps too rotten to eat. The narrator said, "Hunger strips away dignity, until only survival remains." His scar itched in the cold, his body shuddering with weakness. Max let out a broken bark, hoarse and empty, swallowed by the night. He thought, "Even silence denies me comfort." Headlights cut through the night, growing brighter. Max froze, golden eyes wide, ears pricked. The truck slowed, and a man leaned out, bottle in hand. The glass shattered at Max's paws, laughter echoing cruelly. The narrator said, "When cruelty becomes the language of men, silence itself would be mercy." Max bolted into darkness, lungs burning, heart pounding like drums of war. He fled not only danger, but despair. Dawn crept across the horizon, painting the world in muted gray. Max trudged through damp grass, body aching from the night's torment. His paws were raw, yet his eyes carried a stubborn glimmer. The narrator said, "This is where the story asks us to care, not simply to watch." A soft whimper rose from nearby bushes, fragile and trembling. Max's ears twitched, his body lowering with caution. Through leaves, a small pup huddled, ribs sharp against its skin, eyes wide with fear. Max approached slowly, nose lowered, breath steady, as if telling the frightened soul, "You are not alone." The pup whimpered, shrinking back as Max drew near. Her fragile frame trembled, eyes darting with mistrust. Max paused, lowering himself onto his belly, head tilted in gentleness. The narrator said, "Connection does not come from force, but from patience." For a moment, the silence stretched, broken only by shallow breaths. Then Max let out a soft chuff, not a growl, but a greeting. The pup blinked, unsure, her tiny body quivering. Max held his ground, unmoving, offering trust before asking for it. In the stillness, something shifted, fear cracked, and hope seeped in. Max inched closer, paw dragging across the damp soil. Daisy whimpered, but did not retreat. Her gaze locked onto his scarred muzzle. The narrator said, "Pain recognizes itself, and in that recognition, trust is born." Max nudged a scrap of soggy bread he had carried, pushing it gently toward her. Daisy sniffed, hesitating before nibbling hungrily, her ribs shivering with each bite. Max watched, tail thumping faintly against the ground. For the first time since his abandonment, he was not entirely alone. Daisy crept closer, her fragile body brushing against Max's side. Her whimpers softened into shallow breaths, her head lowering onto his paw. The narrator said, "Sometimes the greatest courage lies in allowing yourself to lean on another." Max stiffened at first, unused to such closeness, but his body softened. He licked her ear gently, a promise whispered without words. The bond was fragile, fragile as glass, yet strong enough to spark warmth against the cold morning air. The morning grew brighter, shadows retreating. Max stood, legs stiff, scanning the horizon while Daisy pressed close to his side. The narrator said, "Where once he walked alone, now two hearts beat together." Hunger gnawed at them both, yet the loneliness felt lighter. Daisy whimpered softly, leaning into him, and Max's gaze softened. He knew survival was no longer his burden alone. The road ahead remained uncertain, but together they carried the spark of hope. The story was no longer about one, but about two souls learning to trust. The day grew harsher as Max and Daisy moved closer to town. Smoke curled from chimneys, but safety was an illusion. A man loomed near an alley, his eyes cold, his grip on a chain cruel. The narrator said, "Not all shadows are silent, some carry cruelty." Max stiffened, body tense, scarred muzzle lifting in defiance. Daisy whimpered, shrinking behind him. The man sneered, muttering, "Strays don't belong here." His hand twitched with the chain, threat sharp in the air. Max growled low, his body braced, torn between fear and courage. The world pressed down, darker than ever. The chain rattled as the man stepped closer, his boots scraping against gravel. Max's growl deepened, his body a shield between Daisy and the threat. The narrator said, "Even broken souls will rise when another depends on them." Daisy pressed tighter, her small frame trembling, eyes locked on Max with desperate trust. The man swung the chain in warning, cruel grin twisting his face. Max lunged forward, not to attack, but to stand unyielding, his scar a symbol of battles survived. The air bristled with danger, tension sharp enough to cut. The man cursed and swung the chain wide, striking the wall with a sharp clang. Daisy yelped, shrinking further into Max's side. "Ah!" The narrator said, "Fear spreads quickly, but courage can stand like a wall." Max barked, sharp and guttural, the sound cracking through the alley. His body shuddered, yet he held his ground. The man hesitated, momentarily startled by defiance. In that pause, hope flickered. Daisy looked up at Max, her trust deepening in the shadow of cruelty. The man growled, stepping forward with menace, but a sudden horn blast cut the air. A car passed on the nearby road, headlights briefly illuminating the alley. The narrator said, "Sometimes fate interrupts cruelty with a moment's grace." Distracted, the man cursed and backed away, chain slackening. Max seized the moment, nudging Daisy and guiding her quickly away. Daisy stumbled but followed, her steps clumsy yet determined. Behind them, the man's curses faded into the distance, swallowed by the city's noise. They slipped into the outskirts, breaths ragged, paws aching. Daisy leaned heavily against Max, but her eyes no longer held only fear. The narrator said, "When the world shows its worst, the bonds forged in survival shine brighter." Max slowed his pace to match hers, his scarred face softening as he glanced down. Daisy whispered in silence through her trust, "I believe in you." For the first time, Max carried not only himself, but another soul who saw him as more than broken. Together, they stepped into the uncertain path ahead. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with amber light, as Max and Daisy staggered along the outskirts. Hunger had weakened them, but something new appeared. A woman knelt by a gate, her hands gentle as she poured food into a bowl. The narrator said, "Hope often arrives not with thunder, but with quiet compassion." The woman's eyes softened as she noticed the strays, her voice calm. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." Max froze, scarred muzzle lifted, torn between fear and longing. Daisy pressed closer, her eyes wide but curious. The air shifted, not with threat, but with a fragile promise. The woman set the bowl down gently, stepping back, her palms open. The narrator said, "Trust must be offered before it is earned." Max sniffed the air, muscles taut, his body shielding Daisy. Daisy whined softly, hunger pulling her forward. Max growled low, torn between instinct and need. The woman whispered, "You don't have to be afraid. You're safe here." Her tone carried patience, not demand. Max's scar caught the last ray of sun, a mark of battles survived. He lowered his head slightly, not in surrender but in consideration. Max edged forward, his nose twitching at the scent of food. Daisy whimpered and inched beside him, her ribs trembling with hunger. The narrator said, "Even the strongest hearts bend to survival, and even survival can become trust." Max stopped inches away, body tense, then glanced back at Daisy. She looked up at him, her gaze pleading. Slowly, Max lowered his muzzle to the bowl, nudging food toward her first. Daisy nibbled quickly, eyes closing with relief. For the first time, the fear in her small body eased. The woman knelt slowly, her eyes never leaving Max's cot. "You've been through so much," she whispered, voice trembling with empathy. The narrator said, "Sometimes compassion is not grand, it is fragile, offered in broken syllables." Max's ears flicked, his eyes narrowing, then softening. Daisy licked the woman's outstretched fingers timidly, her small body shaking. Max tensed, then relaxed slightly as the woman's hand hovered near. It was not touch yet, it was permission. For Max, that distance meant more than the touch itself. The air grew still, and Max lowered his head, his scar catching the faint twilight. The narrator said, "The scars of betrayal are not erased in a moment, but they can be touched by kindness." Daisy leaned against Max, her trust growing. The woman whispered, "You're safe here," her words soft but sure. Max stepped closer, his body tense but unyielding, allowing the distance between them to shrink. For the first time, his golden eyes reflected not only fear, but the faint glimmer of possibility. Night fell heavy with storm clouds as Max stood guard near the farmhouse. Daisy huddled close, her body shaking with unease. From the distance came familiar footsteps. The cruel man from the alley returned, chain clutched in his hand. The narrator said, "Some enemies never vanish, they wait for darkness to strike again." Max's scar burned as memory collided with reality. The man sneered, shouting, "I told you strays don't belong here." The woman stepped out, her face pale but determined. Max braced himself, his growl low, his body pressed between danger and those he vowed to protect. Then advanced, chain rattling like a weapon. Daisy whimpered and pressed herself under Max, trembling. The woman shouted, "Leave them alone." Her voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. The narrator said, "When cruelty confronts compassion, the clash is inevitable." Max lunged forward, not reckless but purposeful. His growl deepened, echoing with defiance. The man swung the chain, sparks flying as it struck the ground. Max's body never faltered, his scar a symbol of survival, his stance a promise that he would not yield again. Rain poured suddenly, drenching the earth. The man cursed, raising the chain for a strike. The narrator said, "In the fiercest storms, courage must rise, even if it shakes." Daisy yelped as Max lunged forward, colliding with the chain's arcade. Pain seared across his back, but he pressed closer, teeth snapping in warning. The man stumbled, shocked by resistance. Daisy cried out, pawing desperately at Max's side. The woman rushed forward, grabbing a fallen branch, ready to defend alongside them. The chain slipped from the man's hand as the woman swung the branch, forcing him back. Max stood firm despite the sting of wounds, his golden eyes fierce. Daisy pressed against him, her tiny body seeking safety. The narrator said, "Even the broken become shields when love demands it." The man staggered, snarling, before turning to flee into the storm. His curses faded as thunder swallowed him. The woman dropped the branch, breathless, falling to her knees. Max lowered his head beside her, chest heaving, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and triumph. Rain eased to a drizzle, the storm passing but leaving silence heavy. Max collapsed onto the wet ground, Daisy immediately curling against him. The woman reached forward, her trembling hand brushing gently against his scar. The narrator said, "Trust is not won in peace, it is forged in fire." Max did not flinch. His eyes softened as he looked at Daisy, and then at the woman. For the first time, he allowed himself to rest, knowing he was no longer alone in the fight. In that fragile moment, battle gave way to the beginning of healing. Morning broke calm after the storm, golden light spilling across the farmhouse yard. Max lay weak, but no longer trembling, his scar glistening under the sun. Daisy nestled tightly against him, her small body finally still. The woman knelt nearby, her hands gentle as she whispered, "You're safe now." The narrator said, "Healing does not begin in silence. It begins when pain is met with patience." Max closed his eyes, not out of fear but out of fragile trust. The first step was taken, not in strength, but in surrender to kindness. Inside the farmhouse, warmth returned with the smell of bread and the crackle of fire. Max stood hesitantly on the threshold, paws muddy, scar catching the glow. Daisy darted forward, her curiosity stronger than fear. The narrator said, "To step into safety requires courage greater than battle. It asks the heart to believe again." The woman smiled gently, patting the rug near the fire. Max took one slow step, then another, each movement weighted with doubt, yet pulled by hope. Daisy barked softly, urging him onward. Max lowered himself onto the rug, his scarred body curling as Daisy nestled against him. The woman sat nearby, her eyes moist with quiet relief. She whispered, "You've been waiting so long for this peace." The narrator said, "Trust is not given in grand moments. It arrives softly, like breath, like warmth." Max sighed, his golden eyes drifting toward the flames, his body finally easing. Daisy's tail thumped gently against the floor, her small frame filled with comfort. For the first time, they both belonged somewhere. Days passed gently. Max grew stronger, his ribs less visible, his coat beginning to shine again. Daisy played clumsily with scraps of cloth, her joy returning. The woman brushed Max's fur, her hand steady, her voice soft, "You're healing, both of you." The narrator said, "Scars do not fade quickly, but love makes them easier to bear." Max lifted his head, golden eyes calmer, watching Daisy chase the light on the floor. For the first time, laughter and trust filled the space they now called home. Evenings became calm, the farmhouse filled with quiet peace. Max rested by the fire while Daisy curled against him. The woman sat in her chair, her book unopened as her gaze lingered on them. The narrator said, "Redemption is not the erasure of pain, it is the choice to live despite it." Max's scar still marked him, but it no longer defined him. His heart, once hardened, now carried the weight of belonging. Daisy dreamed softly, safe at last. Together, they had found more than shelter, they had found family. The final days of winter gave way to spring. Fields bloomed near the farmhouse, and for the first time, Max stretched on the grass without fear. Daisy bounded around him, her playful yips filling the air. The woman watched from the porch, her eyes soft with pride. The narrator said, "Peace is not the absence of scars. It is the presence of love despite them." Max rolled gently onto his back, his scar catching sunlight, his golden eyes calm. Daisy pressed her nose against his muzzle, a sign of trust and joy. In that moment, brokenness became beauty. The meadow echoed with laughter as Daisy chased a butterfly, stumbling and tumbling with clumsy joy. Max sat nearby, his posture protective yet relaxed, his eyes softened with pride. The woman stepped closer, her voice warm. "Look how far you've come." The narrator said, "Even the smallest victories carry the weight of redemption." Daisy barked happily, spinning in circles, her once fragile body now stronger. Max's tail thumped steadily, his scar no longer a mark of sorrow but of survival. Together, they celebrated life's simple gift, freedom. As evening approached, the woman sat with Max and Daisy under a blossoming tree. She stroked Max's fur, her fingers grazing the scar with care. Daisy rested her head on her lap, eyes closing in comfort. The narrator said, "Family is not given by blood. It is forged in trials endured together." Max leaned into the woman's touch, his body no longer tense but trusting. Daisy sighed softly, drifting into sleep. The sky burned orange with sunset, painting their silhouettes in warmth. For the first time, they were not just survivors, they were whole. Twilight deepened, stars beginning to pierce the sky. Max and Daisy followed the woman down a dirt path, their steps steady and calm. The narrator said, "To walk forward together is the final proof of trust restored." Daisy skipped ahead, glancing back with playful eyes. Max walked close to the woman, his scarred face calm, his golden eyes glowing in starlight. The woman smiled down at him, whispering, "We made it, didn't we?" In their quiet journey, there was no fear left, only belonging. Under the rising moon, Max paused on a hilltop overlooking the fields. Daisy curled at his side, while the woman stood behind them with hands folded in peace. The narrator said, "Some scars never fade, yet they no longer bind. They remind us that love can grow even in broken places." Max lifted his head, golden eyes reflecting the moonlight, his scar glowing not as a wound, but as a testament. Daisy leaned closer, her body warm against his. Together they stood in silence, no longer afraid, only alive, only love.